Coastal Virginia brought in thriving commerce as American shipping took off in the 19th century. But in June of 1855, disaster pulled into Portsmouth, taking thousands of lives in two cities. Next, one of America's worst epidemics of yellow fever as we examine history through the lens. Yellow fever, it started 170 years ago this month. Hi, I'm Tom Schaad. Today, we are looking at history through the lens. Imagine a pestilence so devastating that it took a third of the population from two thriving cities in Virginia. Such was the yellow fever epidemic of 1855. It took a vast human toll on Norfolk and Portsmouth. My guest, Lon Wagner, former journalist for the Virginian Pilot newspaper and author of The Fever, the most fatal plague in American history. Lon joins us from Roanoke. Thank you so much for being with us today. And you were nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for a series of articles you wrote 20 years ago for the Virginian Pilot, and that is what this book is based on. And I read it, and it was some fantastic work. And the first thing I want to ask you, Lon, is what led you to want to write about yellow fever?
Well, it was really my role just as a resident of Norfolk. At the time, in the early 2000s, I lived in Colonial Place, which is surrounded by water. And I'm sure everybody who's watching this show remembers Hurricane Isabel. And there were some other nor'easters around that time that led to some flooding in our neighborhood. And one day I saw a notice that somebody was coming to the Civic League meeting from the Norfolk Health Department to talk about our neighborhood rat infestation. And I had already done battle with squirrels in my house, and I didn't want to take on rats as well, so I thought I better go to the meeting. And there was a woman there from the Norfolk Health Department, and she was very, she looked like somebody who had baked her grandchildren cookies before the meeting. And, she had this floral dress on, and she seemed very peaceful. And when she started talking about rats and mosquitoes, she got very animated, and she started talking about how you can kill them. And somebody in the neighborhood, somebody in the audience raised their hand and said, well, is there a humane way to kill rats? And she said, well, there's a trap called have a heart. You can have a heart now, but you've got to kill them sometime. And so I thought this woman was a fascinating character, and I followed up with her on a story, and the story didn't really pan out. But at the end of it, I said, why are you so adamant about, rats and mosquitoes and things like that? And she said, well, I'm sure you heard of the 1855 yellow fever epidemic. And like many people in Norfolk and Portsmouth, I had heard of it, but I knew very little.
Right.
And so that's really kind of what lit the fuse of my curiosity. I went back and I started seeing what sort of firsthand documents I might find about the epidemic.
Oh, and some of your research too led to some fascinating stories. But first, just walk us through, what was it like from your research in 1855, Portsmouth and Norfolk? Let's go back to June of that year, and what would you have found if you were walking around those two cities?
Well, they were a little bit different. Norfolk was a little bit more developed at the time. So they were very proud that they had paved for those days, paved and graded the streets. So when it rained, water would run downhill all the way to the harbor and run into the harbor, and that would also wash all any nasty stuff that was in the streets at the time would also wash down into the Elizabeth River. Portsmouth did not have as many streets leveled, and so they would drain that way. But of course, Portsmouth had just an amazingly active shipbuilding and ship repair community. The naval yard over in Gosport employed 1,500 people. It had the first dry dock ever built in the nation for servicing ships out of the water. And, it was a very vibrant community. If you think about I compare it to I-95 now. The I-95 of the mid 1800s was the Atlantic coast. And so if you had a perch on the Atlantic coast, like Savannah, Charleston, Norfolk, all the way up, I mean, that was essentially Main Street America. And so Norfolk and Portsmouth had, a bird's eye view. They were really ideally located. And a lot of people thought they're really close to just taking off.
Yeah, thriving port cities on the east coast of America, pretty much where all the action was happening. 1855. This is pre-Civil War. We're in the time of slavery too. So just tell us what was life like at that time, especially for the enslaved population here.
Well, I was just talking to somebody about this yesterday, and the shame of it is that at that time, Black people could not read, or most Black people could not read or write.
Most, right.
And enslaved people were actually prohibited from reading and writing in a lot of cases. So there isn't as much firsthand information as I would like to have about those folks. The interesting thing was that there was a long circulating school of thought that Black people could not get yellow fever.
Mm-hmm.
And so when an epidemic would break out in whatever city, the leaders would try to get Black people to become nurses. And in some cases, it would almost be like forced labor. But by the time 1855 came around, there had been some examples where people had to think, wait a minute, they're not immune. And there had also been some examples where they were kind of forced, and while they abandoned their taking care of their loved ones, they were helping, white people. And I think by the time the mid 1800s came around, everybody knew that was not the case, and the Black people said, no, we were left to our own, fate many times in these epidemics. We're going to take care of our own community. You all have to find some nurses, for yourself.
Wow. We're going to come back, take a little break right now, and when we come back, we'll go back into the sequence of events that led to the epidemic in 1855 and study some very interesting people in Norfolk and Portsmouth at that time who tried to help the people who were suffering from yellow fever. We're back with more History Through the Lens after this. This is History Through the Lens. I'm Tom Schaad, back with Lon Wagner, who's a former journalist for the Virginian Pilot, also author of The Fever, and it's about yellow fever. 170 years ago this month, it devastated Norfolk and Portsmouth, the worst plague in American history. I don't think we're using hyperbole, Lon, when we say that, because as far as per capita, we had 3,000 deaths in those two cities, and something, I guess, unmatched since that time. Could you walk us through now what happened in June? It was from the Benjamin Franklin, one of the ships that came into Portsmouth. Is that the origin of yellow fever here in this epidemic?
That's correct. And the ship came in from St. Thomas in the West Indies, where yellow fever had been rampant all that spring, hopping from ship to ship in harbor. And, bad luck for Norfolk and Portsmouth. It was actually bound for New York. New York should have been possibly the recipient of that summer's epidemic, but on the way up the coast, it started leaking. And the captain tried to make it like dead sprint for New York and realized about halfway up the coast, he wasn't going to make it. And he was familiar with the shipyards in Portsmouth. And so he pulled in and came down the Elizabeth, where they got halted by the health officer, as was practice at the time. A ship would go into quarantine for a few days until they could make sure there was no disease on board. And that it rolled into town on the evening of June 6th, 1855. On June 19th, the health officer cleared it to go into a small shipyard near the Navy Yard. The shipyard was called Page and Allen Shipyard. And they were going to repair the hole around the mast, and the Franklin would be on the way. So we're at a really interesting date here as we're taping this. It's June 26th.
Right.
And that was about a week after they let the ship into town. Nothing had really happened yet. So people were starting to think, hey, we're probably okay on this one. Nobody's gotten sick or anything like that.
When did people realize something was wrong?
There was a guy who came into town to work on the ship. His last name was Carter. And on July 4th, he went over to Old Point Comfort. It was their day off, holiday, and hung out with friends on the beach. And on July 5th, it was time to go to work, and Carter didn't show up.
Mm.
And people thought he might have celebrated too much the day before, and he had a hangover and couldn't come to work. But then the next day and the next day, he didn't show up. And they went to check on him, and he was laid out in bed, really, really, really sick.
And we had
called in.
Oh, no, go
What's
ahead.
that?
No, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt your train of thought.
Well, they called in some Navy doctors because, Navy doctors have been all around the world and they've seen all the tropical diseases. And they examined this Carter guy, and I won't go into the gruesome symptoms, but the gruesome symptoms indicated that he had yellow fever, and that like just lit a fuse of panic in Portsmouth. And there was an immediate emergency city council meeting. So that's kind of the first awareness that people had, was on July 8th, that something had gone wrong.
Yeah, I was going to say that people knew what yellow fever was because we had had several epidemics prior to 1855.
Right. The problem with, the situation with immunity, if you ever have yellow fever, you're immune for life. There hadn't been an epidemic in Norfolk or Portsmouth, a major one, for 3 decades. So essentially, the population was full of non-immune people. So anywhere an infected mosquito landed, it was quite literally fresh meat. The epidemic was going to, increase because the mosquito was biting a non-immune person.
And then people thought this was person-to-person contact, too, that could spread it, which was later found to be not true.
Right. Which led to a lot of people not being treated, even just left alone in rooms, and they may have died of dehydration.
Oh, my. Speaking of tragedies, we go to a neighborhood now, an Irish neighborhood in Norfolk called Barry's Row, right down. It was located down by Church Street, and I know we have a picture of it there, one of the old maps. And you write about a fire that occurred there during the epidemic. Could you walk us through that story?
Well, it was one evening, and I think we're going to get to George Armstrong, but one of the main characters in the book, Reverend George Armstrong, and his family were having dinner, and they saw, a lot of light flashing, in the sky. And he went to the door and he looked, and he said, "Oh no, I know where this is." And Barry's Row was a row of tenements inhabited entirely by Irish immigrants who were there, like workers working in shipyards and stuff. They had just arrived to the United States, and people knew that some folks in Barry's Row had become sick, and so the first thing they did was wall it off with big boards, around it, so nobody could come or go, to sort of keep the sickness where it was. And then on this particular night, it seemed that somebody had taken the situation in his or her own hands and set the tenements on fire.
Oh my!
And the chilling thing about this is when Armstrong arrived over at the scene, he noticed the fire company standing around and just watching. They weren't, as he said, they didn't attempt to spray a drop of water on the buildings.
And there were 3,000 people all watching this, which is
there were
number.
probably several thousand people, because there's nothing to do, right? At this point, the town. This was early August, and at this point, the town is pretty much shut down from commerce and stuff like that. So that would have been an exciting night, and the buildings were wooden, so they went up fast.
And so they thought that this might nip this in the bud, if you will, right? And kind of an unwritten, or should I say unspoken solution of the problem.
Right, but what it meant to George Armstrong was that now the epidemic had entered a lawless, era that, the fire department wasn't going to do anything about it.
Hmm.
People were going to take things into their own hands.
Wow. Wow, that is a very chilling story. And you brought up George Armstrong. We're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about this very interesting man who gave a lot in the fight against yellow fever in Norfolk and Portsmouth, but also was a very complicated individual. We'll talk about that with journalist Lon Wagner when we get back. This is Tom Schaad with History Through the Lens. My guest, Lon Wagner, who is a former journalist with the Virginian Pilot and also author of a book, The Fever, about the yellow fever epidemic. And wow, I mean, these segments go too quickly. We could
They
talk
do.
about this for hours on end because it is a fascinating story. Let's go into some of the personalities involved. A name that keeps coming up, we brought up in our last segment, the Reverend George Armstrong, the founder of the Presbyterian Church, the first Presbyterian Church of Norfolk. And he was a very interesting individual. I have a quote from him when he was from the Southern Argus, a newspaper that appeared in one of your articles. The physician and Christian pastor are, by their profession, called to minister the sick, the dying, and the afflicted, he thought. No personal danger or threat to his family should influence the decision. He would stay in Norfolk and face whatever came his way. Remarkable, considering that a lot of people back then thought that if you did minister the sick, you will catch it and die. It was a brave decision. It sure appears to be.
Right. So Armstrong, really interesting background. He came from up north, not 60 miles outside of New York City, and made his way to Virginia. And a brother of his had come down to Virginia, and Armstrong got a position as a chemistry teacher at Washington University, now Washington and Lee. And he was in parallel studying to become a minister. And so he was serving a small church in Lexington, Virginia, teaching at the university, and then he got the call to come to Norfolk. First Presbyterian was, at the time, the big leagues for a Presbyterian minister. It was one of the largest churches in the South. And so when he started observing the epidemic and started journaling about it, it was great for me because he didn't come at it as a religious man, but he came at it as a scientist. And he sort of used his scientific thinking to document things. So it was really helpful for me throughout his journaling to see his observations.
And he also paid a tremendous price with his family, too, losing most of his family to the yellow fever epidemic.
He did. And that's one thing I think people ask, what other information that you couldn't find would you like to know? And I would like to know what George Armstrong's wife said when he said, I'm going to stay in town. We know that he related that she said, well, if you're staying in town, we're keeping the family together. Right. Which is interesting because isn't that a decision that we all face when there's a Category 2 hurricane coming at Hampton roads, and you're like, okay, who's staying, who's leaving? Do we stick together? Do we all go? So even though it was a yellow fever, I think we've all faced decisions like that.
Yeah, just an incredible story. And again, given the knowledge of the time when we didn't have the research to suggest that this was mosquito-borne, that, people were worried. We talked about the fire, in that neighborhood, that Irish tenement that burned down, possibly set deliberately because people were so upset and they were getting hysterical in many ways about the spread of this scourge through both cities. And they're thinking that you're going to catch this and you're going to die. This is a death sentence.
Right. And Armstrong he's representative of the people who are really truly heroes of this epidemic. Doctors who came in from Philadelphia and Charleston and Savannah, and nurse volunteers from New Orleans, and all of them knew that they were risking their lives to come and help people. But that's how it worked then. There was no FEMA, There was no American Red Cross. Any support came from the goodwill of your fellow citizens. And in another epidemic, Norfolk had helped out New Orleans. So New Orleans remembered that, and they sent people up to help Norfolk. So it's really a cool story as to how that particular summer the country banded together. And it wasn't, it's very parallel. Like it was similar to Hurricane Katrina.
Right.
That summer, all eyes were on Norfolk and Portsmouth. Similar to Western North Carolina, Hurricane Helene. Everybody was watching Western North Carolina. So that's what I want people in Hampton Roads to understand, is that this is more than a local story. This was the national news of the summer of 1855.
And there was no cable, there was no television, there was no Twitter, there was no social media. Everything was, shipping, newspapers. Word got around much slower. We lived in a 3-mile-per-hour world in those days.
Right. And science moved that slowly as well. So that's why you think about COVID, a vaccine was developed in about 18 months. Yellow fever, it took 100 years.
Wow. And I guess, was it Walter Reed, I believe, who was the one who said that this was from mosquitoes? Am I correct?
He's the first one to scientifically prove that.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good. I was pulling that from my head. I probably should have had it written down in front of me. Okay. And getting back to George Armstrong, he said, "I have faith to believe that for his own purposes, God means to keep us one people." Remarkable for the time. Whenever you are in 1855, you're in Virginia, and you're seeing all the help that came from both the North and the South, helping these people. And that was proof before his eyes that we were a special country at that time.
Philadelphia.
Despite the divisions we had.
Right. And I can't overstate Philadelphia had no real trading connections to Norfolk and Portsmouth, but contributed more than any other city. The people at a Boston shipyard, the workers there gave their entire day's salary, sum total, and sent that money down. It was up and down the coast, but the country was united, at least for this moment, in helping our two cities.
And there was a story of an enslaved person, too, who gave all they had, 10 cents, all they had.
A young boy.
It was a boy. Wow. Mm-hmm. Because it brought me back to the story that Jesus told in the Bible about the widow's mite, and that she was blessed more than all the other wealthy people who were giving from their surplus. She gave from her heart all she had. And here's this little boy who is enslaved in America, giving all he has to help people, many of whom may have had him as a slave. It's just fascinating to get to that. And while we're on that topic, I know this is something that you want to get the book about this, because George Armstrong, we said earlier, he's very complicated, a complex character. That's something that you research very well. That's in your book. You got to read about it. It's fascinating. And now I'm getting the signal from my producer, Michael. My Lord, this was such a fast conversation. Lon Wagner, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. History Through the Lens. The book is The Fever, the Most Fatal Plague in American History, published just last year. So it's very up to date, November of 24. And thank you for joining us today on History Through the Lens.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you, Tom.
And remember, we make history every day. Thanks for joining us.